Welcome back. I'm with world-renowned political philosopher, Professor Francis Fukuyama. We're talking about the situation around the world, and we will be focusing on South Africa in a moment. Just before the break, Prof, I mentioned or asked a question about the influence of China, and you gave some ideas on how African countries can negotiate or drive a bargain with China, which is very hard because some of the governments on the continent are very weak themselves, right?
Yes.
And the countries go through civil strife, so it must be very hard, and they are desperate for support from China. So you know, there's no bargaining position or a strong bargaining position that they can move from.
Well, I think they need help. So part of that is a matter of cooperation within Africa, you know, among African countries. The other is, you know, you need to play the West off of China. China is not the only source of support and infrastructure. I know that Africa's experience dealing with Western institutions in the past has not always been that positive, but in a way, you have two blocks, you know, Europe, China, also the United States, that are competing with one another, and that actually should put you in a position where you can play one off against the other, and that's a source of leverage.
But you know, as you said earlier, the other challenge for African countries is lack of cooperation amongst themselves. Besides the fact that the infrastructure is lagging, why do you think that is the case? What makes it difficult for African countries to cooperate? I mean, we've had the OAU, it existed from when, 1963 until now. So it's over 50 years of an organization being in existence that's supposed to drive and promote cooperation amongst Africans.
Well, you know, one of the facts is that Africa is a very diverse place. I don't think there's a natural ground for cooperation simply because you're a country in Africa. They differ by language, by cultural tradition, by historical background. And that's something that really needs leadership. I think, you know, you need statesmen that get up and say, we're actually going to create a new institutional structure and we're going to sacrifice our short-term interests in order to promote that. Many times a powerful international organization needs a leader. And that actually suggests that South Africa, you know, might have a big role because it's one of the most powerful countries in this region. Because I don't think that weak, small countries by themselves ever, you know, coalesce very easily.
Well, there was a time when African citizens in respective countries believed that that was possible, but that era seems to be gone, at least for now. That is not possible. And I can cite in the immediate region here of Southern Africa that in South Africa many people wonder what happened in Zimbabwe and why the SADC bloc was not capable of helping resolve the problems of Zimbabwe. I'm not even talking about West Africa or East Africa or Central Africa. So, you know, where will that leadership emerge from? Having made that statement, I want you to comment on what you think led to the degeneration of Zimbabwe, and that this has been going on for a long time, and the problem is not about to be resolved, it appears.
Yeah. Well, you know, I think that ZANU-PF and Robert Mugabe entrenched themselves. They used the prestige that came out of their independence struggle to legitimate themselves, but then they were a bunch of thieves and basically ran the country into the ground. And the outside world really wasn't willing to do anything, or maybe didn't have the levers to stop that process. I think, you know, entrenched power is very hard to remove, and I unfortunately for the people of Zimbabwe, that's what happened.
Well, the South African leaders over time, over 15, 20 years, have successively said, leave Zimbabwe to the Zimbabweans, they'll find their own solution. And you're saying the world sat on the sidelines and could not intervene. So what do you make of the South African attitude to Zimbabwe's problems?
Well, you know, nobody's talking about direct military intervention, anything like that, but I think moral leadership could have helped, and I think there are numerous points in Zimbabwe's recent history where a stronger South African role criticizing the dictatorship or criticizing, you know, a crazy economic policy may have done some good in persuading, you know, voices within the Zimbabwean leadership to take a different course. You know, sometimes words matter. Sometimes, you know, moral leadership can have an effect.
South Africans are actually concerned that the country might be going the same direction as Zimbabwe, but for a different reason. Not that the democratic institutions are collapsing necessarily, but that the economy has stagnated and we've got a whole number of social problems facing us, and that the system itself has become so corrupted. And in 1994, the optimism was palpable that South Africa was meant for great things. But after 25 years, there's great disappointment in the air. What do you think led us to this point, having looked at different parts of the world, that maybe we are naive to think that you can make things happen in 25 years, or we made certain mistakes along the way?
Well, I think you made certain mistakes along the way. I mean, at the beginning, there was really a very visionary leadership under Nelson Mandela that had a vision for, you know, a new South African nation. And I think over time, I mean, it's just one of those facts of life. You don't always get great leaders. And I think, you know, the last president in particular and the group around him really did a tremendous amount of damage to the country's institutions because of, you know, basically putting personal self-interest over any kind of national interest. And I think it's really critical if the economy is to start growing again and if South Africa is to regain the kind of moral position that it once occupied, that that legacy be rejected and that the institutions be reformed to prevent it from happening again.
But the role of the citizens in all of this, because, you know, as I say, we could have been naive as citizens in 1994 that it's going to be like this forever and that we're going to become a great nation. And of course, there's a lot of disappointment as a result of that. Is there anything that citizens can do to help rebuild the country and put it on that path of growth and moral leadership?
I think that no democracy can survive without an active civil society, and that means citizens banding together in order to advocate for things, to press the government, to be watchdogs over the government. If you don't, and it begins with things like an independent media, but it also takes, you know, active monitoring of what the government does. So sure, citizens can do a lot, but they have to realize that things are not going to be handed from above, you know, down to them if they don't take responsibility into their own hands.
I would even suggest that the people are beginning to lose faith in democracy, the liberal type of democracy, as it were, that it has not delivered the goods to a majority of people. We sit with high unemployment rate here and no growth whatsoever. And there's talk in some quarters that maybe we need to look to China to help rebuild our economy and create opportunities. But it's not easy to grow at the rates that China grew at, you know, being a democratic society such as we are. So what are we to do? Because there's tension between the freedoms of democracy on one side and the demands of economic growth on the other side.
Well, I don't think that the China model is an alternative for Africa. I think that there are things in Chinese history, like the respect for meritocracy and bureaucracy, that, you know, have allowed it to be successful. But other countries with other historical traditions, I think, are just likely to end up as bad dictatorships. I think if you think that there's an authoritarian alternative, you know, you have to look around Africa and see that you know, the vast majority of African dictatorships have really been economically disastrous. There are a couple of, you know, better ones. Ethiopia and Rwanda are sometimes put forward as a kind of African version of the China model, and they have done pretty well economically, but I think they too are going to have problems in keeping that model sustained. And so, and then the question is, you know, like Rwanda is a pretty small country. Could you imagine South Africa ever having, you know, that kind of a government? And I think the answer to that is probably no.
I wanted to touch on the other forces that drive change in the world outside the formal political ones that we have touched on. Global finance, for instance, and technology, the fourth industrial revolution. What impact do you think these forces are going to have on change, and how should nations respond to them?
Well, we've already had a demonstration of the power, for example, of social media. 20 years ago, when the internet first appeared, people thought it was going to be good for democracy, and it has been good for democracy in many respects, allowing people to get information, mobilized, but it's also been weaponized. And that, I think, is the new threat that's appeared, where every election now can be manipulated by outsiders or by bad actors within, one society. And I think it's a learning process. We didn't even realize in the United States, the most technologically advanced country, we didn't realize that this was a problem until 2016 when the Russians tried to interfere in our election. So I think it's a continuous process of trying to run up and keep up with technology, and you'll never be able to stand still because the technology is going to keep evolving.
What do you make of the way different countries of the world, even in multilateral institutions, are responding to the major challenge of our time, that of climate change? Is the world ready to deal with it? And then are the leaders applying their minds enough, you think?
Well, I think that the kinds of responses that have been taken are dramatically inadequate, really, to deal with this situation. It's partly the incentives, because dealing with climate change means making sacrifices in the short run, that will help other countries or will help, maybe your children's generation. And so it's very difficult to get countries to actually do the things that are necessary. We do need much more international cooperation. That's why I'm very disappointed that my own government decided to leave the Paris Accords, because without that kind of big country leadership, I don't think smaller countries are going to move on these issues.
Well, you have been spot on with some of the predictions on the basis of your analysis of the past. Now, as we cast our eyes into the future, I'd like to hear your comments on the future of the United States, given where it is now under Trump, the situation in South America, specifically Venezuela. You've been in South Africa, it's a couple of days. You might say, you're not the right person to pose this question to, but how do you think South Africa can get out of its current situation? What kind of future do you foresee for U.S., for Venezuela, and for South Africa?
Well, for my country, it's really going to depend on the 2020 election. If Donald Trump is reelected, I think that the damage to American leadership and institutions may be quite severe. If he's not reelected, then I think we can repair a lot of that. Venezuela is, it's a sad story, because this regime should not have survived as long as it has. It's been a complete disaster. Its GDP is half the size of what it was just a few years ago. How this is going to be resolved, I don't know, but it's probably going to have to be something within the regime that splits it apart and then gives it a fresh opening. With your country, I think it really depends on the way that citizens react to the revelations about corruption, because I really do think that's the single thing that's holding South Africa back. And you're not going to get rid of corruption unless people are angry, want better quality government, want officials that care about public interest rather than just enriching themselves. And if people don't care, then you're not going to fix the problem. So that's the question I think that South Africans need to ask themselves.
Professor Fukuyama, thank you very much for having been my guest. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
And that's Professor Francis Fukuyama, and after the break, we'll be turning our focus to the South African education system.